White rage is perhaps one of the most dangerous weapons on this planet. We saw a glimpse of it with the public execution of Charlie Kirk. So, against that background, I want to talk to you a little bit about white supremacy versus black supremacy. For the record, I do not believe in any kind of supremacy because I think it is antithetical to the survival of us as a species. We often hear the term white supremacy being thrown around, usually in the context of racism and or white rage. It is used more colloquially as an insult, but white supremacy is not an insult, it's an ideology. In part 1 of this series, we explained what white supremacy is, and I'll put the definition on the screen for you to kind of refresh your memory on what that means. Now, what I'm hoping to achieve in this video is to determine if white supremacy and black supremacy are the same thing. Do they have the same meaning, effect, and outcomes? For example, could a white person reasonably claim that black supremacy exists and has the same level of influence and impact on white people as white supremacy has historically had on black and other non-white communities? In 1790, the US Congress passed its first federal naturalization law. It granted citizens only to free white persons of good character. That meant black people, Native Americans, or Asians could not become citizens of the United States by any means. So we can see that race was part of the legal foundation of the US, as only whites could claim citizenship by law. After the Civil War, the US Congress did amend the naturalization law so that citizenship was extended to, quote-unquote, aliens of African nativity and, quote-unquote, persons of African descent. But Asian immigrants, unfortunately, were excluded. So even with that change, whiteness remained the dominant standard for who could be presumed eligible to belong in the US. The Supreme Court played a role in shaping how race and citizenship were defined in the United States of America. In 1922, Ozawa, a Japanese immigrant, argued that he could be considered white or eligible for naturalization. He had lived in the US for decades, spoke English fluently, practiced Christianity, and raised his family in Hawaii. But the court ruled that a Japanese immigrant could not be considered, quote-unquote, white in law. A year later, Bhagat Singh Thind, an Indian Sikh man who had served in the US Army during World War I, made a different case. He argued that according to the racial science of the time, Indians were Caucasians and therefore white under the law, and that he should now be eligible for becoming a United States citizen. But the court rejected his claim using what it called, quote-unquote, common understanding of whiteness. In other words, what the average white American understood whiteness to mean, and that definition did not include an Indian man. These two landmark cases show how the US Supreme Court helped reinforce a system where whiteness became the gatekeeper to citizenship. As you can see, there was no blatant endorsement of white supremacy, but the effect was the same. Race shaped who could legally become a US citizen. Now, just to remind you that this video is about showing white supremacy in action, and we are going to hold that up to the idea of black supremacy so that we can question, do they lead to the same outcomes? Still on white supremacy side, let's talk about Jim Crow. Jim Crow wasn't an actual person. It was a name pulled from a racist minstrel character in the 1800s. That name became shorthand for a whole system of laws and customs designed to keep black people separate and unequal. Jim Crow laws were passed across the southern states starting in the late 1800s. They forced segregation in schools, buses, restaurants, hospitals, pretty much every public space that you can think of. These laws stayed in place well into the 1960s. Now, we're not talking about regular white people being racist and not wanting to socialize with black people. We're talking about actual laws that were written on the books, enforced by the police, upheld by the courts, and backed by violence when needed. Segregation was the law. They used poll taxes, literary tests, segregation in schools, hospitals, and public spaces, as well as jury exclusions to prevent black Americans from voting, serving on juries, or having a legal voice in the political system that governed their lives. These laws were part of a broader structure that kept civic life tilted towards whiteness. And we have to understand that structure and how it worked if we want to make a fair comparison of black supremacy later on. The phrase separate but equal, a white supremacy law, which was upheld by the Supreme Court in 1896 in the case Plessy v. Ferguson, giving legal protection to racial segregation across the country. The Supreme Court claimed that it was constitutional to separate black and white Americans in public spaces as long as the facilities were quote-unquote equal. I leave you to decide whether or not you believe they were actually equal. That ruling stood for almost 60 years until Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, when it was finally struck down. Brown versus Board of Education made it clear that separate was inherently unequal and segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. Psychology has shown us how far people will go when they can blame someone or something else for their actions. The Milgram experiment proved that. When someone in authority tells you to act, you feel like the responsibility isn't yours. You're capable of doing things you never thought that you would do. So while the US courts were shaping the law, white Americans were terrorizing black communities. The Equal Justice Initiative documented over 4,000 racial terror lynchings between 1877 and 1950. We're talking about gruesome acts of public murders that were meant to send a message to black people that you are not welcomed here. You're not supposed to be near our families or part of our communities. I mean, people were killed just for trying to vote, for speaking up, or simply refusing to step aside on a pavement. These acts of violence were part of a system designed to keep black people in fear and show them what happens when they step outside the box that white supremacy placed them in. Now, we're going to move on from Jim Crow to redlining. In the 1930s, the federal government, through an agency called the Homeowners Loans Corporation, started drawing neighborhood risk maps. Basically, they were trying to determine how safe or how dangerous a neighborhood was. And that categorization would then be used in various decision-making processes. So these graded neighborhood maps, they graded neighborhoods from best to hazardous. And now, would you be surprised if I told you that nearly all black neighborhoods were marked as hazardous? Anyways, the bank then used these color-coded maps to deny black families access to mortgages, insurance, and investments. This, in effect, made it difficult for black families to advance economically. Studies from the American Economic Association show that the neighborhoods marked red ended up with lower rates of home ownership, lower property values, and deeper racial segregations even decades later. When a family has unfettered access to land, to loans, to legal protection over generations, that builds generational wealth. It builds stability, it builds leverage, and it builds a kind of psychological safety where the children of that generation growing up know that the legal system is there to protect them. Then There's the family that's been forcefully shut out from those same things. When the law closes the door and they turn to face a lynch mob outside, that builds something too. Learned helplessness, an avoidance of risk, a reflexive fragility, a constant state of flight or flight that reshapes the psyche, a deep us versus them mentality, a fierce distrust of authority. Because when the law is used to oppress you, how does that shape your view of the law, even after it's been changed? These are the legacies of white supremacy. It was a system of injustice and violence, born out of white rage, white envy, and a deep fear of losing control. White supremacy is what white people believed about themselves, what they built, what they protected, what they passed down, and what they destroyed to keep it. They left physical and psychological scars that live in the memories of their victims, in their behaviors, in their silence. They shape how people see themselves, how they move through the world, and how they trust or don't. White supremacy dominated and marked its victims, and those marks did not fade just because the laws changed. Now, let us step into the black supremacy arena. Black supremacy is the belief that black people are superior or should be dominant. That's the definition. But when we look at American history, there is no period where black people took over the country. No era where black lawmakers wrote the citizenship code to favor only themselves. No time when judges, bankers, and police enforced a racial order that kept white people out of schools, neighborhoods, juries, or voting booths. That never happened. There's no record of black-led governments lynching white citizens under the protection of the law. So when we talk about white supremacy versus black supremacy, we're not looking at two sides of the same coin. The United States has a measurable legacy of white supremacy, but there is none of black supremacy. Yet some people, at least Myron Gaines,
and what we're dealing with right now in America is literally a backlash to this black supremacy has been able to run around unchecked for a long time, and no one has the balls to call it out.
Most of these social media influencers are former federal agents. Anyways, what we do see are small separatist sects or sectarian groups that push black extremist ideologies. The Nation of Islam, for example, has long promoted the Yaqub myth, a story that claims white people were created by a black scientist and are inherently evil. But the Nation of Islam has never controlled the US government, so far as I know. They never passed laws, their views have never been backed by the courts or written into policy, and they sure as hell do not represent the mainstream black politics. There's also the Black Hebrew Israelites. This is a movement, and most people who identify with this movement aren't violent, but some sects do preach hate, and in 2019, 2 attackers who embraced those ideologies killed 3 people at a kosher market in Jersey City. Authorities called it domestic terrorism, driven by anti-Semitism and anti-police beliefs. Once again, there is no institutional structure in place that is backed by the government. In comparing white and black supremacy, we need to examine scale and power. White supremacy had the full weight of the United States government behind it. It controlled who could be citizen, who could own land, who could vote, who could live where. It even used violence to maintain the racial order. It used policies, zoning maps, and court rulings to ensure whites remained superior in society and maintained an economic advantage. That is why the gaps in wealth and opportunity are so hard to close. Black supremacy, on the other hand, shows up in small groups with almost no institutional power. Some of these groups are hateful, yes, and some are indeed dangerous, but they do not run the judicial system. they don't have control over the courts, and they do not control access to housing, finance, or investment. They cannot decide who gets a mortgage or who sits on a jury. So, what does the current security landscape look like? Federal threat assessment have consistently flagged domestic violent extremists as the top terrorism concern. Within that, white supremacist extremists are named as the most persistent and lethal threat in the United States of America. The 2025 Homeland Threat Assessment still highlights white superiority beliefs as a driver of sabotage and attacks. There is no parallel federal finding naming black supremacy as a persistent or lethal threat. Why does this matter? Because words like supremacy are being used by bad actors to foment racial tensions and incite a civil war. If one ideology shaped governance, law, and finance for nearly a century, and another exists mostly in fringe sects, you can't pretend they pose the same kind of threat to democracy. Yes, both deserve condemnation for the hate and division they cause, but they are not equal in reach, in impact, or in the scars they left on history. Let us bring it back to the maps because they are relevant even today in 2025. The old redlining grades drawn by the federal government still match up with lower home values and lower rates of home ownership today. People living in those neighborhoods were made poorer because the system decided a lower appraisal for those homes, which led to wealth gaps that persist even today. If your family had access to subsidized mortgages and rising property values in the green zones, that gets passed down until it reached to you in 2025. If your family, on the other hand, was locked out or pushed into the red zones, that also gets passed down to you in 2025. This has to do with compounding average and compounding loss. But the people who benefited from white supremacy like to pretend that, history does not matter and has no impact on the present. White supremacy left a lasting scar on blocking economic advancement through the laws and policies that were implemented, through violence, and through the machinery of zoning and finance. Black supremacy, by contrast, hasn't held such institutional power. It did not leave any lasting scars on the psyche of white Americans. Black supremacy has never run America, never wrote one law, and today is still not even considered a threat. In the realm of opinion, where feelings masquerade as facts, we must remain ever vigilant about who we allow to influence us. White man, white man, white man, white man, white man.